Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all had a great lunch. I'm Anwesha, I'm a project manager at HasGeek, and today we'll be discussing open source AI and open data challenges regarding the two and how it affects the FOSS community specifically. So first off, to the panelists, I would like to ask you, why do you think this topic of open sourcing AI, why is it important, and especially in the context of this being a conference with FOSS developers and enthusiasts?
Can I go first?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so what has FOSS been about? Like, for all these years, ever since the Unix philosophy and Free Software Foundation came into being, it has always been about providing a viable alternative. It's always been about equalizing the power that big tech and monopolies have had. And the four freedoms have essentially been about democratizing code so that we can build a community of developing these frameworks, architectures, softwares. So where does open source AI step into this vision of FOSS? Well, I think it's the challenge is now to look at how AI has been a way to concentrate data collection and data extraction and all sorts of tasks related to the classification of data as a public good has now gone into a private realm. So now FOSS has to look into how open source AI can create the same democratic effect that FOSS has had for a long time. And yeah, I'd like to hear what other people about think about this. Yeah.
So the way I look at it is this whole open source AI is like open source 2.0, because if you take a step back, open source always existed to kind of break the monopoly, create diversity for mid-sized organizations, independent developers to contribute and create an ecosystem where there's a collaborative ecosystem for companies to use either point solutions that are open source. So now we are seeing the way AI has evolved. So a lot of companies, either big companies, are coming in with a mindset to kind of challenge the big companies. But if you see, the mid-sized organizations or developers are coming in to contribute and make it more like free and open source software. So anything and everything that touches around AI, not just models, the training data sets or the MLOps frameworks. So everything is kind of being contributed to the community to make the community much bigger and more impactful for companies.
Hello. I come from a slightly philosophical point of view of free software. So traditionally, when like your proprietary companies build software, it's for their own use cases, and when they decide to like sell it, you have very specific use cases that they allow you to do. But what free software is about is that you should be able to change it, modify it, and tailor it to your own use case, share it with others, so you can have even more use cases. And AI so far has been incredibly useful, but the closed source part of it means that you are restricted to only a few of the use cases. So just think about how much more useful it can be, how much the freedom to unlock more use cases comes up when we have more open source AI.
So I think I'll try and summarize what I'm also hearing my panelists say is that, there's transparency, the freedom to investigate. There's correction of market power, and then there is, I think, something that might have been a second sort of offhand statement, which is the adaptability, that when you have open source software, you can build applications adapted to diverse needs, which, especially if you are in low middle income countries, is quite important. So I think just from a very sort of equity and utility perspective, open source AI is quite important. The other background to all of this is that till 10 years back, most of the work in most of the work in AI and ML development was happening in academia. A lot of the work was openly published, and it's only over the last 5 years that we're seeing more and more of this work getting concentrated in few tech companies that have access to this data. So in some ways, I think this conversation of open source AI is a correction to the trend that has happened, because the default for AI development so far till about 2011, 2012 was actually open source by default.
Thank you. So when we're now talking about open source AI, in relation to free and open source software, how would you define open source AI, and what are the sort of components that fall under it? And also maybe what do you think would be the risks and challenges related to open source AI? Yeah, over to, I'll start with Tarunima, if you could share a bit about OSI's definition.
Yeah. So just as you mentioned, I'm wearing two hats today, right? So I am the research lead and co-founder at Patil, and we build machine learning tools in the open, and separately I'm also going to just talk about OSI's definition, the Open Source Initiative's definition on open source AI. So one, that it's not a self-evident definition, because unlike software, there are more artifacts, and data, for example, is a very unique artifact in how we build AI systems, right? So the current version, so OSI has been taking this consultative process over the last 6 months, and they've been having these workshops and sort of have collaboratively come up with a definition which is now called the V0.0.9, where they're saying that what they believe is open source AI is open code, open weights, but as far as data is concerned, it is information on how the data set is created. So the 4 freedoms as they apply to data in particular does not require you to release your data. And there are a couple of reasons that they have reached this conclusion. For example, there are issues around copyright, there are issues around privacy. From our own work at Patil, there are issues also just around labor compensation, in that certain entities should be paying for certain data sets. And I can get into this later in the panel. But that is where the definition is, and it is open for consultation. And so if you all have strong opinions about any aspect of this definition, I highly encourage you to go to the OSI website and share your feedback.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would love to play the devil's advocate here and ask you that, and sort of propose the idea that even the training data sets should be open source. But I guess like the argument I have in my head is that if you do that, then nobody will really, people will just disregard OSI, because nobody wants to make their training data open source, because it might just put them in a bunch of trouble. But yeah, I would like some more nuance on it. What are your thoughts?
I don't want this to become just me talking, so maybe we can hear the others as well, and then I can respond.
So probably I'll take that question. So before that, just want to take a step back and explain the whole concept of open source AI. So what involves? So AI basically is helping anyone just solve a use case where you have access to data and you convert the data to something that mimics a human capability. So there are a lot of components, like there are algorithms, there are models, there are data sets, and you have even like MLOps, the framework, so many things. So combined all these components, everything that can be made free and open source, available for companies to use it in their own infrastructure. So fundamentally, we kind of define that as open source AI. So now coming back to, I think one of the risks I called out is like the data sets, which is made. I think that is one of the biggest risks we would say today, because as we started the AI revolution, people start talking about responsible AI. And now I think models are more like becoming like a commodity. Like you have a foundational model, you just pick it up, you train it or tune it and use it for use case. But we have an ecosystem of data sets that's being published. So I think I would like to coin this like responsible data sets. Like how do company responsibly publish the data sets or use the data sets to make sure they're ethical and responsible, like being labeled and tagged for the use cases.
So one thing I think is interesting that's coming across from both of everyone's discussion so far has been that the infrastructure and the data sets, right, they exist at the same time. And within the FOSS framework, what can we do to democratize data set creation, right? Like what can we do to enable this process of extracting data from, let's say, a corpus of text or a corpus of images that we know are in the public domain, for instance. So there are frameworks that exist for this, and such as the AI for Bharat's Indic LLM pipeline, OpenAI in legal data sets. They're publishing pipelines and tools that allow you to create your own data sets. Some of them are doing it in a way that's highly specialized, like it's multilingual. So there's always going to be a degree of responsibility that comes into creating these data sets. I believe she was talking about how there's privacy and security and such aspects involved. So yeah, these are going to exist as they normally do in any framework for me. But here the big question that comes into playing is who's enabling the creation of these data sets, and whether the frameworks that they provide are responsible enough for the user to even implement them in the way FOSS has been implemented responsibly so far.
Tarunima, if you want to respond, go for it.
No, I think everyone has touched upon the different aspects. So I think even the OSI definition says that where possible, open data sets, use public data sets. But I think realistically, and for a lot of us who have been in this space, we realize the limits of that, quite soon. And so I think as long as we work with this orientation of as open as possible, as closed as necessary, for us to be developing our AI models responsibly, I think we're heading in the right direction. I don't think this is, like I said, it's not self-evident, and maybe in a couple of years we'd want to revisit this definition. But I think for a lot of people who worked with data sets, we've realized that fully open data sets, especially as it pertains to people's data, is not always the most responsible thing to do.
Thank you. So if when it comes to open data, let's sort of dig a little deeper. What would you say are some of the challenges with also to start off, how would you define a high quality data set given whatever use case, and what are the sort of challenges when it comes to creating these high quality data sets, maintaining them, sharing them, etc.?
So high quality data sets, again, I might be a little biased because, for example, I was reading the other day, the data sets that are available in the West, when you pick up a model and you train the data sets for West audience might not work for the Asians. Just an example, right? So fundamentally, data sets can only do so much where you can kind of train and take the model off the shelf. So beyond that, a lot of domain specific training comes into picture. So a lot of risk involved. Just fundamentally the data sets is like the attribution. And as I said before, the responsibility of using those data sets, and are those data sets coming from the right population, because you might want to kind of train your model. So the kind of data sets coming from the population and the diversification of the data sets. So all these kind of parameters are pretty fundamentals to mitigate the risks.
Yeah, I sort of echo with what Nagendra said. If you have bad data, you're feeding it to an AI model, you end up in garbage in, garbage out. So you want data that is close to your use case, that mimics preferably the data is created by whoever you want to reach. So they feel familiar with it.
Yeah, so regarding the creation of, high quality data sets, it's one of the examples of this is in the GitHub Accelerator. There was a dataset creation company that got through. It's called LLMware, and they're using this. They're using LLMs in a domain-specific way by powering data sets that are used to train small language models. And yeah, so we're seeing this across the board, across many industries. There's data sets that are geared towards financial use cases, that are geared towards, let's say, more public use cases. We are seeing the vocabulary of digital public goods come in. But now the one thing that I do want to mention is that there is going to be a domain-specific expertise that should go. Otherwise, we're all familiar, I think, in the LLM space with how fine-tuning a model, retraining a model on synthetic data again and again can lead to loss of quality. And we don't want to enter a space where the nuance of that any particular domain is lost. So like at Schematize, what I'm doing is providing legal ontologies as one of the solutions to my legal data sets. And I think that's just one of the solutions. A lot of organizations in India in my domain are trying to get a collaborative sort of data set creation model. Like they're establishing wikis for this purpose. So yeah, I think these are some of the methods that I think we can use.
So I think for us in the context of our work, high quality data set actually means data that recognizes and foregrounds the human labor that has gone into creating that data set. So for example, we've all been talking about FOSS as a way of democratizing access, FOSS as a way of democratizing participation. And then I think we should think about what that means in the context of creating data sets, right? And it's not just a function of, because when we're building these data sets, we're collecting it from, say, people like everyday citizens who might not be very well versed with technology, yet we are interested in that data. And then how do you get them to be active participants in creating that data set? And also how do you adequately recognize their labor and ensure that their contribution to that data set is recognized throughout the value chain of AI development. So for example, when we've built a data set on gendered abuse in Indian languages, all the people who annotated the data sets, it was people who were working with marginalized communities who have a very lived understanding of gendered abuse. And then, thinking very hard about paying them in a way that honors their experience and also making sure that they're recognized on all the authorship. And it's not just the computer scientists and the engineers, but also everyone who has built the data set contributing to the model. I think by centering sort of someone's expertise and lived experience, you automatically kind of filter out for a lot of the issues that you have with low quality data sets and low effort, or work where you don't have stakes in the problem statement to begin with, or where the annotators might not have stakes in the problem to begin with.
So I kind of echo with us. So I like to add on one more point, right? When we talk about high quality data sets, so from the open source context, the moment we take a model and pick up a couple of data sets and complete the training, so once you kind of move beyond just training, move closer to a production use case. So data today, I think for an organization is fragmented. So consolidation or even accessing the right data at the right time for either training a model or tuning a model, and not just making sure the data is consolidated and being made available for the model, because a model is as good as the data. So the data sets can just help you take the model off the ground. And the feedback, so it becomes extremely important, like the right feedback you get to make sure like your data sets are credible enough to make sure that you're tapping into the right data set. So that's one of the points.
So in the spirit of collaboration, what can we expect in terms of collaborative efforts to create these sort of open data sets?
So yeah, collaboration, right? Now data sets, they capture various data points. And in the modern world, we're going to see specializations into various fields that can collaborate on these data points. So we need to look at the models that already exist for these data collection strategies, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of people use feedback and also public consensus as a way of constructing their nuances. But we need to look at a broader coalition of such organizations. And that's what I think would really help. And we're not seeing that from any major market player. And that's where I think open source and free and open source software communities can really band together to create that conglomerated product that is nuanced in every aspect. Yeah.
I think creating a collaborative environment where, where the contributors can either, like for example, if I take platforms like Kaggle where you have hundreds of data sets. So over time, creating an environment where this either LLM generated content or the data sets are watermarked, or you have some kind of tagging, or as I said, the very important aspect is feedback, which also helps in making sure, like creates an ecosystem of collaboration where you can kind of collect important feedback aspects and make sure what is the right data, like what is the kind of not so right data.
On collaborative collection of data, I recall this one initiative by someone who was trying to build LLMs in Telugu, build or fine-tune, and they went to a bunch of places to gather this data from different Telugu populations where they could get it. That was very interesting that they did all this and crowdsourced this data. Yeah, that's one model I can think of. It's quite interesting.
So I think when it comes to data, we are looking at a lot of different, forms of norms around ownership, sharing. So for example, a lot of indigenous communities don't want to share their data openly because they feel like that the power imbalance is so steep that opening data just means that their data is appropriated without them getting the returns for it, right? And I think there is space for those. I mean, it's a very legitimate argument. And so I think, even as we think about communities creating their own data sets, I think we should also be open to the fact that the communities will create the norms around those data sets, and that's absolutely okay. Specifically, if we are saying that, let's talk about open data sets and public data sets, there are some domains that are more amenable to that kind of a very permissive license, and there are some spaces where we should be more, we should be accepting of different kinds of data sharing norms. I think I mentioned it in my previous response as well in terms of, the governance is very important. How people are compensated is very important. How people relate to each other when they create these data sets is very important. The relationship between the people giving the data and the relationship between the people stewarding and holding the data set is very important. So paying attention to all of those relations and how they're expressed legally and pragmatically, I think is quite important as well.
Thank you. We can open it up for audience Q&A.
Hi, my name is Pranesh, and I want to just preface this by saying I am a lawyer, and so I'm coming from that perspective. I think folks in this room, as in many other places, don't realize how big of a threat copyright and data protection laws are for AI in general. And so I'm a lawyer. I've studied the data protection law in India. In my opinion, things like search engines and pretty much most forms of machine learning, which rely on large quantities of data, are currently illegal under the Data Protection Act. They don't fall under any of the exceptions, and in order to use any data, you don't know whether it contains personally identifiable information or not. And even if it does, even just to remove PII, which many models do, even doing that action is itself processing. So first you're collecting the data and then you're removing whatever you might through models think are PII. That itself is processing, and even to just do that, you need consent under the current laws. So search engines, okay, are now essentially illegal in India. And in 2011, there was an exception created under copyright law, under which search engines might, for search engines, but without using the term search engines. And there is no such exception for collecting that kind of data for AI. So copyright and data protection are life-threatening to most forms of machine learning. And if any of you is concerned about that, you really need to start looking at the law around both copyright and data protection, and working for advocacy to actually change the laws in India or to make them more amenable to this in such a way as to not completely negate data protection, but to actually ensure that it's not life-threatening to AI as we know it. Second, and I want to make clear, even things like Wikipedia and Wikidata, which you might think are prime examples of things that you're free to use, right? Even those get covered. So Wikipedia has data on it, personal data on it, which was not made public by the individual himself or herself. And thus, you can't actually use even Wikipedia scraped data without consent. And getting consent from billions of people is not possible at all. And even synthetic data, nowadays, copyright holders, big media companies, are starting to think about going after even synthetically generated data, which has been generated by first collecting things which are under copyright, as most things in the world are under copyright, pretty much. And you don't have to apply for copyright. That's a frequent misconception amongst many people. Anything you write online, including just tweets, a meme that is created, etc., is copyrighted. So every day you engage in dozens, if not hundreds of acts of copyright infringement under the law. You're just lucky that each of those is not prosecuted, but each of those is prosecutable. And that's the state of the laws, and we really need to change that. The only thing that might survive are things like federated learning, okay? But I wouldn't bet on lawyers not going after even federated learning. One last point is I disagree with what Tarunima said specifically about communities and their rights over data and norms, etc., because we know, not just in India, but worldwide, that these kinds of practices around access to knowledge, restricting access to knowledge, access to data, can be really oppressive, can be used to discriminate on the basis of tribe, on the basis of caste, creed, and so on. So we shouldn't defer to communities and existing knowledge practices when we are trying to build data commons, when we are trying to build open source systems and so on, because it can be used for really, these kinds of practices can be really harmful. And one can't have a blanket rule or a blanket rule of thumb that one should always defer to communities that exist. They know better. Lived experiences matter more than what these outsiders come with their own data norms and so on. I don't think one can take that for granted. And one has to approach this and I don't think that's a principle. Okay, that's just a form of practical negotiation around access to knowledge, and not something one should actually make a principle out of, because that can be very harmful.
So regarding your first couple of points, firstly, when we say copyright is a restriction and it's going to threaten the very existence of AI, we're talking about how AI is, in the global context at least, it is something that generates data that is not permissible, let's say, by copyright. And that is why we are talking about this, presumably, as one of the many reasons, one of those reasons. Yeah, okay. So I'll address that. So where does the act of collecting and regurgitating both of these become copyright? In the purely legal sense, this becomes a copyright issue when the data set is either published or expressed and in a I'm not a practicing lawyer, but since you said if any of you have looked into the law, I'm talking about what I've seen from the law. Allow me to just finish my point. So, and the second thing is when we talk about regurgitating, we're also looking at how we look at all of these AI LLM apps and we're thinking of them as the only concept of the UI in which they can exist. Why can't we think of a framework in which the copyright is, why can't we imagine a framework where the copyright is respected and the attribution is provided in data sets which are licensed as such, and in data sets where the code has been reutilized? Why can't we remodel our instances? And this is where the FOSS community's role really comes into play, because the FOSS community has always been on the side of copyright responsibly used. And this is why the copyright needs a movement that will enable even the FOSS coders to assert their rights over their own expressive creative content. And here is where you said that there is a law that prohibits AI content creation, but I am constrained to think of a judgment where this would have been decided. If by logical conclusion we come to this fact, then it is a gray area of law. And in gray areas of law, we side on the side of caution, and that would, for me at least, be copyright law. And we can think of a framework where FOSS unites with open source platforms, with LLMs, and creates its own framework for this collection of data, for this utilization of data, and where the copyright is respected. That's my point of view on those first couple of points. And yeah, if anyone else.
Could I just add some legal clarity
Yeah, sure.
to that?
I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I've looked into it, so I'm talking about it.
So I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I'm a lawyer by training. I studied law, and I've worked on tech policy issues for the last 16 years.
Yes, I'm aware.
And copyright does not apply only when you're making available publicly or otherwise copyrighted content. Even reproducing copyrighted content for internal use, when you're downloading something off the internet, even when it comes to just on your own computer, when you're browsing, copies are being made, right?
Yeah,
in
that's
your
true.
RAM, in cache, and so on. Each one of those is counted as reproduction for copyright purposes. It is only in 2011 that we got an exception in Indian copyright law for what is called transient and incidental usage. And it's only because of that that even using computers is legal right now. Okay, because until 2011, using computers was copyright infringing in India. And we had to fight for things like this to get included in the law. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the law isn't wide enough, okay, to cover, or might not be wide enough, let me say, and this is, in case anyone is interested in reading more about this is section 52(1)(b) of the Copyright Act. So go look that up. And in my opinion, AI and collecting data for AI, whether it falls within the transient and incidental usage, right at that first step of data collection, of data scraping, of working with reproduced data which has been doesn't abide by copyright law, that itself, that very first step, can be a problem. And
I completely agree with you. That's always been a problem.
No, it's not. For search engines, because the transient and incidental usage exception comes into play. Okay, for search engines now under copyright law, there's an exception, not necessarily for AI. And under data protection law, both search engines and any kind of large data usage for AI purposes is now unlawful. It does not. It's not unlawful. You need consent to do it.
I think we need to keep in mind that this is an interpretation of the law that we're seeing about AI, because there is no precedent. So we don't want to prohibit innovation from the FOSS community, especially when it stands at a crucial point in developing open source data sets, open source AI.
Which is why, as someone who supports free and open source software, I'm really concerned about these laws. I believe these laws need to change, and I'm not arguing for enforcement of these laws, but the very opposite. I think we need a thriving free and open source ecosystem, including in things like AI. And in this respect, one thing I might just point out about the OSI definition, when they talk about the preferred form to make modifications to machine learning systems, under 0.0.9 definition, the definition of data information doesn't say you need to make data sets open. Okay, it essentially says that it should be such that a skilled person can recreate a substantially equivalent system, which isn't defined what substantially equivalent system is, but using the same or similar data. So even if you don't have access to the same data set as the developers of a particular model, they can still say, we've been open enough in our model cards, we've described the data in enough detail, we've described how it's used, the kind of cleaning that we did, etc., for you to be able to recreate this model on your own, and that would allow for it to be considered open source under the 0.0.9 definition.
So I'll just kind of give a short answer. So I don't have a one size fits all kind of answer. So we have different moving parts here. So one, we are talking about data leaks where the private data or the domain-specific data is being published. On the other side, we're talking about data governance. We're talking about laws that are kind of governing these the synthesized data. So this is a new problem what we are facing, because GDPR always existed like, hey, user should have a consent to delete the PII data or have control over PII data. LLMs always existed. But what has kind of brought into the surface is the generative AI, the whole chat GPTs of the world's coming in. So what's also coming into place are newer compliances or newer kind of frameworks that are evolving. So if you see, the moderation is becoming a big industry where even open source, of course, you cannot bring in a strong moderation. It's more of laws or kind of consent that comes into picture. But if you talk about like ChatGPT, which has a strong moderation, so there are newer policies or compliances that are coming into picture. It's more like an evolving field. But what works, the laws that you're talking about, is mostly tied to data-centric AI. But what we are now seeing is more like AI that is synthesizing data, synthesizing newer content. So that needs more moderation. I think that's more of an evolving field. But I don't think I have an immediate one size fits all of an answer for now.
So I'm also just mindful if there are other questions, Pranesh. I think this might just become a battle we can take off stage. So I think, I won't respond to the copyright bit except for saying that I think we need jurisprudence on this, and maybe it'll be case law that clarifies what some of these laws mean in context of AI. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't quite have a very as well-informed interpretation as you do. I would say on the question of norms and whether we should enable for specific groups to come up with their own norms around data sharing, I will say that groups that are doing this are the exception. It's not that anyone and everyone has the resources or the wherewithal to create these data sets, maintain them over the long run. So for the most part, you have data sets that are held by certain corporates. You have open data sets, and then you have a few smaller data sets that are actually community-based. And I am not a maximalist in that I actually feel, it's not as if open source is a norm-absent concept, right? It's a norm-loaded concept. And so I think there is space for a variety of norms. And I don't think it in any ways is inimical or it threatens open data sets that you have a few groups that want to build data sets by slightly different norms. I think there is space for all of that because they are minority ones. I just think the power dynamic is not in a place where we need to come down on those specific groups. Yeah.
On the OSI definition, I think you raised a very good point, and I feel like it's not completely fair that they say with substantial skill you should be able to replicate the model, because it's not only skill, but you need a lot of computing power to just scrape as much data as they do and then to reproduce it. So there's a lack of equity there, but at the same time I feel like not many models would fit into the definition if it wasn't the case, and that supports innovation.
So it just occurred to me that the Supreme Court had released a hackathon asking for AI to do some of its registry tasks. And it just seems implausible that the interpretation that AI is illegal and collection of data is illegal would have been a task that would have been afforded to us without any interpretation by the Supreme Court itself. But let's keep that for after this discussion.
Let me just add one small thing, okay? Under Article 6 of the GDPR, one of the bases for processing of data is legitimate interest. That
Right.
is not a basis under Section 4 of the Indian law.
Sure.
And Section 4 of the Indian law is much stricter than the GDPR in this regard, and which is why what is legal even under one of the strictest data protection regimes in the GDPR, okay, is actually not lawful in India because the law is actually different. It's not the same data protection law
I
throughout
agree,
the
I
world.
agree. But there are certain actions, and just one last thing. There's a superstructure that AI is putting into place that we are often ignoring, and this is going to be relevant in terms of what Tarunima and you were talking about, and this is definitely going to come into place when consent is seen, because platforms are now increasingly becoming ignorant of their users' rights and all of the copyright licenses under which the data is created. So I think since we talked about legally relevant points, so this is a point that I think we also need to look at in terms of the structure of the system that AI is creating and the responsibility that FOSS has. I'm sorry, but responsibility is the only word that comes to my mind when the 4 freedoms that FOSS has, the environment has created.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we don't have time for any more questions. Being threatened by the FOSS volunteers. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. You can catch up with the panelists outside and ask them your questions. Over to Ashin.
I think we can take one more. It's
Okay,
been
we can take
waiting.
one more question. Yeah.
So there's this one interesting, like we've talked about how you want to open source so that it promotes innovation, but there's also an aspect of this which is like, as a user of the model, you want it to be open source so that you can do good prompt engineering. For example, if you look at Stable Diffusion, to do good prompts for Stable Diffusion, you have to look at the captions for the images that are in the training set. And so they've created browsers where you can search for certain keywords and figure out how to prompt the model, because that's what it's trained on. So not as like a programmer or as a trainer, which is like a much further step, even as the user of that model, you want to have sort of access to just the browsability of like what is in the data set. Like for example, like there's this prompt that says, think step by step, and that increases sort of the accuracy in general for language models. And that's because in the training data set, which is the web, there's a lot of things step by step. And so to be able to discover these techniques as a prompt engineer, I think very important. And so I wonder if there's some way where you can have at least that, if not the whole open source data set, like at least the ability to go and search for what's in the data set to be able to do, to make good use of that model.
So that's a great question. So like getting a glimpse of what's in the data set, right? So today, see a lot of stable diffusion models. Like today, I was just checking this Flux one that just got released. So where I think the problem is not with the generation, the problem is what's behind the scenes with these data sets. So if you see a lot of newer GPT tools or ChatGPT or Perplexity coming up with the suggestions, right? Like which gives you like upfront like workflow or like suggestions like, hey, these are the kind of questions or prompts that you can ask. And so beyond that, again, it's left to the user to take control, but kind of upfront have certain suggestions in the form of like this UI bubbles or those things. So those are kind of coming up, newer ideas, but great question. Just wanted to add that part.
Yeah, I think actually with the OSI definition, because all the ambiguity in that definition is in the data set piece, right? Like what is sufficiently well-detailed data set for someone else to recreate it. I think that's where we're going to see a lot of discussion and debate. And so I think some of these ideas that you're mentioning will be quite useful. And then I think in the practicality, it'll actually become very interesting beyond this one definition.
Okay, thank you. Is there time for any more questions or?
I'm so sorry for
Yeah.
cutting out, but
That's fine. Okay. Thank you, everyone.